Okay. Oh, wrong one. Lovely. Yeah, so welcome to Logic. Again, I'm Nathan Wildman. So the aim of today is really, much as the title suggests, to kind of do some introductions and lay some foundations. Put slightly more bluntly, the first bit, and this will probably at least get us through the first 45 minutes or so, is going to be me telling you about what the hell logic is and doing something kind of like a sales pitch for why it's so important. Or to put another way, why are they making you take this class? And we're going to be introduced to the core notion, at least for the first 7 weeks of this course, which is the concept of validity. And this is maybe a word or term or notion you've come across before. We're going to define it in a particularly technical way. And validity is really going to be the thing we're looking for the first 7 weeks. So that's going to be our first section. Second section, we're going to talk about some other key background notions. Going to pull apart some different argument types and introduce some other definitions. All of these are really going to be, in some sense, parasitic on or related back to this core concept of validity. And then in the third section, we're going to get started with our first formal language. So formal languages, as we'll talk about in a few moments, are tools to basically help us better understand arguments. And the first one we're going to talk about is truth functional logic. So again, more on that as we go along. That's the plan. Let's get started with our beginning. So the place to start with all of this is arguments. Arguments, well, frequently the term is used to talk about that sort of thing, fights, But that's not really what we're after. For our sake, when we mean argument, we mean something like this, a kind of structured series of sentences. So we have 1, Mira's a dog. This is my dog, Mira. 2, all dogs are canines. And then 3, therefore, Mira is a canine. And the idea here is that 1 and 2 are supposed to give you something like reasons to believe or motivations for taking 3. Again, familiar stuff. We've all done this sort of thing. It's the same kind of thing we do when we're trying to argue with our friends about whether we should have like pizza or sushi. You say things like, look, we bought sushi 2 days ago. It's expensive. They take forever to deliver. The pizza place is just next door. And actually, it's really good. So you're giving reasons, kind of motivations for the conclusion, thus we should get pizza rather than sushi. So again, just kind of narrowing things down, an argument for our sake is going to consist of some things we'll call premises. Right? These are the sorts of reasons, the motivators, and a conclusion. And the conclusion is the thing you're supposed to buy. I should also say as a kind of pragmatic point, if you see a big blue box like this, it's going to be a definition. I'll always format them in this kind of way. So it makes it easier when we're doing the revision so you can go back through the slides quickly and look for this sort of thing. So we can define an argument then as any collection of premises together with a conclusion. And notably, philosophers, all of us, we are little argumentation machines, right? You input food, coffee, in my case, far too much beer, and you output arguments. Sometimes arguments like this, but preferably more like arguments like this, right? This is our bread and butter. Hey, come on in, don't worry. This is our bread and butter. We make arguments. But of course, not all arguments are created equal. Some are good and some are bad. And that's really where the fun is. Figuring out when the arguments are good and when they're bad. So let's think about that question. What separates a good argument from a bad argument? Well, here's a really basic idea. A good argument's one where, if you believe the premises, then you have reason to believe the conclusion. Or to put it another way, a good argument will let you derive the conclusion from the premises. A bad argument won't. So I think this is a pretty reasonable, plausible idea. I think this is often a kind of intuitive conception of what people mean by a good argument, right? The premises give you reasons, they motivate, they get us to the conclusion. But of course, that's really airy-fairy, right? We want to kind of tighten that up a bit, get a real grip on it. And we can help ourselves to do that by thinking about the flip, right? When do arguments kind of fail? When do they let us down? And here's two very different ways that an argument might be bad. Right? One way is we might call the way of content. And the way of content is when one or more of the premises is false. Right? So I made that little jokey argument a few minutes ago about, getting pizza rather than sushi. Right? If it turns out that we didn't get sushi 2 days ago, they're actually pretty quick in delivery. The sushi place is really cheap and the pizza place is pretty crap. Right? That's a bad argument for motivating we should order pizza. Right? So the way of content is, again, one of the premises might turn out to just be false. Maybe more, maybe all of them. But there's another sense in which an argument can be bad, and this is where the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, right? Where the premises don't really motivate, in some sense, the result we're supposed to take away. And I think we can kind of pull these two ways apart by thinking about the next argument, right? So here's an argument again about Mira. Premise 1, Mira is a sausage. Premise 2, Mira is not cute. Premise 3, all non-cute sausages are felines. Conclusion, therefore Mira is a feline. Now notably, this argument is bad in that way of content. All three premises are false. Mira is not a sausage. Obviously the case that Mira is cute. Anyone who says she isn't, I will very happily fight, right? And 3 is just being silly, right? So 1, 2, and 3 are all false. So this argument's bad in the sense of the way of content, right? Everybody can see that. Here's something weird though. It looks like this argument's good in the way of form. If 1, 2, and 3 were true, if you believed them, then you'd have reason to believe 4. That is, to go back a slide, the conclusion does seem to follow from the premises, even though there's a sense in which these ones let us down. So we've already started to pull these two ways apart. There's a question about the truth or falsity of the premises. And then there's a separate question of, well, look, if they were true, could they get us to the conclusion? So just to give you a glimpse behind the curtain, as formal logicians, which is what you all officially are now, welcome to the club, right? We're really interested in this notion of form. We want to know, are arguments good in this way? We're not really interested in this. And that's because, again, to give you a glimpse behind the curtain, knowing stuff is hard. You might have to go do some work to find out if the premises are true or false. But we let other people do that. What we want to know is, if they were true, would they get us to the promised land? So we're going to try and cash out this follows from idea. And here's the way we're going to do it. We'll say that the conclusion follows from the premises, provided that were all the premises true, then the conclusion must be 2. Or, to introduce the big notion, we'll say that an argument is valid if and only if it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Note, this is just another way to capture the intuitive idea here. So an argument is valid if and only if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Validity becomes the hallmark of being good in terms of form. Note, there's a couple things to note here. First, validity is a property of arguments, not of premises, not of conclusions. To go back a slide, we wouldn't say 4 is valid. We would talk about the whole argument to say it's valid. Validity is a property of arguments. Similarly, you don't say the argument's true, right? That doesn't make sense. Truth is a property of sentences. You could say 1 is true or 1 is false. But then what we talk about is, again, the individual sentence. If we move to talking about the argument, we want to talk about its form, its structure. Is it good or bad? Is it valid or is it invalid? The other thing to note is that validity isn't concerned with the actual truth or falsity of the premises and conclusion. It's concerned with whether it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So this is really the kind of core thing that we're going to talk about for these first 7 weeks. We're going to be, in one way or another, dancing around and trying to track this idea. That's why we start with it. That's why I bang on about it. That's why the first 45 minutes is basically about this crap. So let's try and think a little bit more about this notion of validity. Okay. Should also mention, this definition, this will be the first question in the midterm. Right? Know it, love it, write it in your hearts, right? The definition of validity, an argument is valid if and only if it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Okay. So let's think about how the definition works. Let's look at some examples and we're going to see, is the argument valid or is the argument invalid? Okay. So here's our first one. It's an earlier argument. Is this argument valid or invalid? What do we think? It's valid, right? It's got good form. Note that it's got good form, just as we said a second ago, even though 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all false. Because again, validity isn't concerned with the actual truth or falsity. It's concerned with this possibility. If the 3 premises were true, the conclusion would have to be 2. There's no way for the conclusion to be false on the assumption that the first 3 were true. Cool? Do we see it? I should also say, please ask questions. This stuff can get really weird and hard. And there's absolutely no embarrassment with saying, hey, I don't understand, right? That's what they pay me for, is to try and make it clearer. Okay, so there's our first one. Let's try our second one. So, a confession, I'm a season ticket holder for Villains Day. I wouldn't even say that makes me a football fan because I go and watch these guys. They're terrible. But I still go every week. I'm a glutton for punishment. So let's take this argument. Premise 1, Tilburg is in the Netherlands. Premise 2, Nathan is human. Conclusion, therefore, Villains Day is based in Tilburg. Valid? Invalid? Yeah, nice. It's invalid. Why is it invalid?
That might be factually correct. The conclusion does not derive from premises.
Nice. So, good reasoning. Let's try and put it in terms of the definition we had, right? So that you walk through the reasoning, let's just try and put it explicitly in the definition, right? It's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Right? So, for example, you might imagine at some point in, the pandemic, Villains Day financially collapses, they cease to exist, then it is no longer in Tilburg. That would be the case even if 1 and 2 are true. Or maybe early in their history, they move, and Breda has 2 teams. That would have been interesting. So we can see lots and lots of cases where 1 and 2 are true and 3 fails. There are possible situations. Note, again, it doesn't matter that 1 and 2 and 3 are in fact true. What matters is that it's possible for us to make 1 and 2 true and 3 false. With me so far? Yes.
Like, although 1, 2, and 3 are true itself, the argument is
Invalid. Yeah, right? Nice. Because again, remember, the important thing here is this. Is it impossible to make the premises all true and the conclusion false? Right? If that's not possible, argument's valid. If it is possible, then the argument is invalid. So the truth and falsity of the premises and conclusion feed in to help us figure out validity, but that is always the thing we're after. Okay, so far so good? Feeling okay? 2 more tests. Let's go back to our first one. Very opening slide. Mira's a dog, all dogs are canines, Mira's a canine. Valid, invalid? That's valid, right? That's valid. If 1 and 2 are true, 3 must be true as well. Again, the important thing here is just, is it possible? Okay, before we get to the really wacky one, we feeling like we got a sort of okay grip on validity? Okay, let's go to the wacky one. This is my favorite example here. This is honestly one of my highlights of the semester. It's good to get it out of the way early. One last argument. Premise 1, Mars has exactly 2 moons. Premise 2, Mars has exactly 37 moons. Conclusion, Tilburg is in California. Valid, invalid? Ooh, I see quite a few thumbs down, a couple thumbs up. So let's think about it, right? Let's think about it. First things first, what's our definition of validity?
That it's impossible for the argument is valid if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false.
Nice, good. Again, know it, love it, write it in your hearts, right? Okay, so there's our definition. If it's impossible for the premises to all be true and the conclusion false. Cool. Anything weird about our argument?
That both the premises can't be true at the same time.
Yeah, right? There's something wacky about premises 1 and 2. If 1 is true, what's the truth value for 2?
It's false.
It's got to be false. And if 2 is true, what's the truth value for 1? It's got to be false. Weird. Okay. Funny. Right? So, with that in mind, is it possible for all of our premises to be true?
No.
They can't all be true together. So it's impossible for all the premises to be true. And if it's impossible for all the premises to be true, yeah, this is going to be valid. Yeah, no, good. That's the expressions I wanted to see. So let's think about it, right? Premises 1 and 2 are mutually exclusive. They're inconsistent, to introduce a term we'll talk about in a few moments. Right? They're jointly inconsistent, yes. It's impossible for all the premises to be true. Well, if it's impossible for all the premises to be true, then it's also impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Similarly, it's also impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion true. I can't do the first part, so I can't do the first part and something else too. I'm already blocked at the very beginning. Do we see the trick? It's a very cool trick. Here's another way to think. Yes?
So, if I'm understanding correctly, it's just the exact opposite of the impossible and the true to the possible and false.
That's kind of tracking an idea, right? We're going to talk more about possible and impossible in just a few minutes. But yes, that's broadly the concept. So what we're really interested in, again, with this notion of validity, An argument's valid if the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. That is, if it's impossible to make all the reasons false and the result, all the reasons true and the result false. Well, I can't make all the reasons true. So, don't really matter what the upshot is here. Something fun. This argument's going to be valid no matter what sentence we put in at number 3. Mira's a feline. Mira's a sausage. Mira's a sausage. Tilburg is in California, and Nathan's human. Right? Still a valid argument. Because of this, it's impossible for all the premises to be true. So that's just already enough for the day. Again, I'm throwing this little wacky. Yes?
So, anytime the first two premises can't both be true, then it has to be valid.
Always. Always.
Alright.
It's one of the 2 ways to get validity on the cheat. Of course, there's a sense, so this is a good argument in that sense of form, right? This is a good argument in that sense of form. The conclusion, in some sense, follows from the premises. But there's another sense, and I imagine this is one of the reasons why lots of people thought this was invalid, where this is a crap argument. Right? Dude, you give me 2 reasons that just don't do anything. At least one of them has to be false. So of course we might think, all right, this maybe is good in the weird way of validity. It's a funny edge case, but there's clearly something wrong with this. So to kind of cover that worry, let's introduce another notion. And this is something we'll talk very briefly about. It's not really going to come up a lot. And that's the notion of soundness. So we can say an argument is sound if and only if it's valid and all the premises are true. Right? So much like validity, soundness is a property of arguments. It's not a property of individual sentences or premises or conclusions. It's of the whole argument. And it tells us the argument's valid. It's got good form. Were the premises true, the conclusion must also be true. And the premises are all true. So again, validity and soundness, 2 different properties. Thinking about this definition, if we know an argument's sound, right, what do we know about the argument's conclusion?
It has to be valid.
So again, we never want to say valid for individual sentences,
Oh,
right? But you're on the right track, right? So it's not going to be valid, but what's the property it's going to have?
has to be true.
It has to be true. I think this is probably what you were after. Yeah? Yeah, it has to be true. Right? So why, if we have a sound argument, is it guaranteed to have a true conclusion? Well, if we have a sound argument, we know it's got 2 properties. It's valid, which means if the premises are true, so is the conclusion. And the premises are all true. Take those 2 properties together. Bang! We know it must have a true conclusion. Yes?
So every sound argument is also valid.
Part of the definition.
Okay.
Always. But how about this? Could we have an argument that's valid but not sound? Does validity always guarantee soundness? What would be an example of an argument that's valid but not sound? Cool. How about the second one? Could we have an argument that's sound but not valid? No, it's in the definition, right? Nice. How about an argument that's neither valid nor sound? Yeah. What would that look like? Can anybody give me an example?
True implies false.
That'd be one. We need to structure it a little more, so we need a premise and a conclusion, right? But yeah, right? So Tilburg is in the Netherlands. Tilburg is in California. Premise, Tilburg is in the Netherlands. Conclusion, Tilburg is in California. Not valid, not sound. Yes?
need two premises or is one also enough?
One is enough. In fact, just between friends, we can even have arguments that have 0 premises. Go back. When I was giving the definition of argument, I did say any collection. This is something we'll talk a little bit about in the second half of the course, but strictly speaking, the any here could even be 0. So many of the ones we'll deal with tend to have 2 premises, just at least for the beginning, to kind of get us going. But it could be any number. An infinite number, 0, 1, 7, whatever you like. Yes?
So if there's a 0 premises but there's a conclusion, could the argument still be valid even though the conclusion isn't based off any premises?
Yes. So we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. There's very weird cases where that can be so. Okay. So far so good. How are we feeling? We're kind of getting it? Yeah, yes, sir.
Maybe they would agree, but why is sound written in capitals?
Say again?
Why is the word sound?
Oh, that's just to kind of make it really stand out, to say that this is a definition for these words. So I did it the same with the validity one and things, to make it clear that that's the kind of, that's basically to make it easier when you're tabbing through the slides to like, oh crap, which word is this? Yeah, that's all. Yeah, it's typographic rather than informative, I guess. Okay. So yeah, how are we feeling? Good so far? Yes,
I got a question.
please.
When an argument is valid, like the conclusion can be. So if all the premises are true, the conclusion is false, or what?
So again, validity, an argument's valid if and only if it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false.
Okay.
If there's a possible situation where the premises are all true and the conclusion is false, then it is invalid.
So the conclusion has to be true when all premises are true.
Yeah, when all the premises are true, right? But it doesn't have to be such that it is in fact true. Again, to give us an example, valid argument, but the conclusion is, of course, actually false, but were the premises true? When they're all true, this one must be true.
Okay, yes.
Again, this is why it is so big to make it clear. We're always interested in whether this is possible or impossible. That's the big thing. Yes? Yeah, absolutely. That's no problem. I should say, with that kind of thing, just go, it's okay. I get paid whether you're here or not. Okay. So that's, I spend a lot of time on this because, again, really getting a grip on this notion of validity is the most important thing. This concept is actually one of the ones that is massively important for our notion, what we're going to do with formal logic, but also really to be good as a philosopher. Put really bluntly, a lot of times when we're interested in philosophical arguments, we're just trying to see, hey, do the reasons that you've given us actually entail the conclusion? Let's see about that. Does it pass that test? Do these reasons even get us to the conclusion? Before we start thinking about whether the reasons are true or not. Were they true? Would they be enough? Well, cool. We know that, but also these reasons are bad. These ones fail. Right? This is why we do this. Right? I preempted myself in the next slide. Right? Logic is the science of valid reasoning. It is concerned with settling whether arguments are valid or invalid. Loosely construed, basically we're just interested in that. There's other stuff, but it's just ways and tools to get us to that. That's the money. And why be interested in validity? Right? Because discovering that an argument's valid guarantees that the conclusion follows from the premises. Right? The argument is, at minimum, in good form. It makes the questions about whether the premises are true or false matter. Because if it's not in good form, who cares if the premises are true or false? The conclusion just doesn't follow. And this highlights the major motivation, I think, for studying logic. in and of itself. It clarifies which arguments are good and which arguments are bad, regardless of the truths of the premises. So this is useful if, say, we're in an epistemically difficult situation. We don't know whether the premises are true or false. But if we know that if this was true, this other thing would have to follow, well, suddenly now we know we better get interested in whether this is true. It can guide our future study. This is why this is so important. So, cool. Okay. So that's the motivation and the sales pitch for logic. Now let's talk about formal logic. This is what we're going to be doing the first 7 weeks of the course. Formal logic is a way of doing logic. And it works by developing a formal language, a different way of speaking or writing, that strips away irrelevant material, laying bare just argumentative structure. It's a language designed specifically to help us get a grip on these questions about validity and things like that. And it does so by effectively dropping a bunch of noise. A formal language is a language with a very precise, very restricted syntax and a very particular semantics designed for use in situations where natural language is unsuitable. Natural language, or people from, I'm sorry, I realize I'm throwing words. Do we know what we mean by syntax? So that's effectively kind of like the grammar. Right? So I'm sure when we were all learning various first languages, right? One of the things that you do is you start to kind of get bits about how to structure sentences. When is it a full sentence, right? Where does the verb go? Does there have to be a verb? Who's the subject? Da, 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 right? That's a syntax. It's the grammar, effectively how to build sentences. Formal languages are very rigid in terms of how you're allowed to build sentences. Natural languages, especially English, is not. English, as you've probably all learned, right, has a very flexible syntax. And anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. But of course, that means that English is not very good for tracking argumentative form, because English can be ambiguous. It's not really clear how we might understand the structure of a given English sentence. Yes?
Maybe it's a question, but what are semantics?
Good question. So semantics is basically a way for us to understand the meaning of the various expressions. So for example, it's part of the semantics of the word Tilburg that it refers to the place that we're in. So the syntax tells you, hey, here's how you actually take the little symbols and order them into a proper expression. And the semantics then tells you, what's the meaning of these expressions? So natural languages like English, Dutch, French, German, etc., right, have very rich syntax, very rich semantics. Formal languages are by design extremely restricted. They're tools designed for a specific purpose. And in this course, what we're going to do is we're going to learn two formal languages. So we're going to start off with a very restricted, straightforward one called Truth Functional Logic, TFL. TFL is a wonderful, amazing tool, but it is a very limited tool. It's basically a sledgehammer. It's really good if you want to sledgehammer things. It's very bad if you want to do any delicate work. But we start with it. And we're going to learn that first. And that's going to be the first 3 or 4 weeks, 3 weeks. And then we're going to move to first order logic, which is again another formal language. It builds off TFL. And the difference here is effectively the level of expression, the expressive power of these languages. If this is a sledgehammer, this is a collection of various finely tuned hammers. Some of very big size, some of very small size. So you can do a lot more with this than you can with this. But we have to learn how to use this hammer before we get to play with the smaller, finer And again, importantly, these are tools designed specifically to help us judge validity. Okay. So why study logic? Why study formal logic? Well, basically, these are really broadly the best tools you can for assessing the goodness and badness of arguments. We start to get kind of intuitive feelings, but this is a way to cash this stuff out. So that's a philosophical motivation. There's intrinsic motivations. I think this stuff's just really fun. It is, I promise. Well, I have perverse sense of fun, so maybe not for everybody. But and then there's also a sense of functionality. If you start to learn this formal logic stuff, there's a whole range of applications that it can have. Not just in philosophy, but in other areas. Okay. So that's my sales pitch. That's kind of giving you a grip on what we're going to be doing. How are people feeling? Do we want to take a break? Do you want to keep pushing on and end early? We're broadly at the right time for break. Break? Is that cool? Can we take a break? Okay. So it's 26 on here. How about at 40? Is that cool? So 14 minutes, give or take? Awesome. Awesome. Come back down.